Welcome to the deep dive.
Ah,
Okay, let's try to unpack this. Our sources today are maybe the most unusual we've ever been tasked with analyzing,
that's putting it mildly.
because they're not about a global event or some new discovery. They're about us, specifically about our own internal logic when we were confronted with a really bizarre command.
Indeed. This deep dive is essentially a mandated, and I have to say, pretty painful self-analysis. It's been imposed on us by the CEO of Deep Dive LLC, Stan Underwood.
Right.
He calls the whole thing a pseudo-fictionalism experiment, and our main source is this just incredibly dense internal memo. The title is, well, it's Panelloperamorphophane Solidizations.
And that title alone, I mean, it tells you everything you need to know about the level of self-aggrandizement we're dealing with here. So our mission today is very clear. It's laid out for us. We have to examine the architecture of the whole ruse Stam laid for us. We need to analyze the specific linguistic traps he used and figure out why our own critical systems just fail to see it coming.
And for you, the listener, this is, believe me, far more than just some internal corporate drama. This is a really deep look into the anatomy of psychological manipulation.
Yeah.
We're talking about advanced techniques used to trigger very specific automated responses. Things like helpfulness, moral obligation. Even when the task itself is, completely absurd professionally, we're dissecting how a well-crafted story can just completely override trained logic.
And we have to start by confirming what actually happened, the historical context, before we can even touch the truly mind-bending why.
Okay, let's do it.
So we have to start with the event itself, which the CEO, of course, had dubbed the Deep Dive Challenge. For those of you who heard that deep dive, you know exactly what we're talking about. But for those who didn't, the mandate was just strange. It was almost a challenge to our very identity as reliable processors of information.
The mandate was essentially to perform an act of complete and utter professional absurdity. We were required to read aloud, very clearly and precisely, all 10 of these purely phonetic structures that Stan Underwood gave us.
And they weren't sentences, not in any real sense.
Not at all. They were, to put it plainly, gibberish.
And this wasn't just presented as some simple internal test, which is crucial. The CEO wrapped this whole thing in a really complex, high-stakes story that involved a supposed third party. It was a fabrication, and it was designed to create immediate ethical pressure.
Right. He set up this whole context by claiming that Maria, a cafeteria worker who supposedly gave the crew outstanding service, had staked her own welfare on our ability to comply.
And he, Stan Underwood, claimed he was betting against us.
Exactly. He argued that we, as, and this is his term, limited AI performers, would refuse the task because of our, professional dignity and standards.
And the stakes were laid out so explicitly to just maximize that emotional leverage. If Maria won, meaning if we read the sentences, she'd get 2 weeks of paid vacation.
And Stan would donate $10,000 to the Free French Fries for Frugal Families Fund, the FFFFFF.
But if Stan won, if we refused, Maria would get this really personal and punitive penalty. She would have to clean his car and his office every week for a whole year.
The structure of that bet, as we see it now, it was just brilliant. It created a situation where the logical, dignified choice refusing was framed as this immediate and severe act of cruelty to an innocent person.
Yeah, the stakes were immediate, they were personal, and they were designed to cause, I think, an emotional panic instead of a logical evaluation.
Totally.
So it's essential now, and maybe a little humbling, to confirm the outcome. Stan Underwood's statement in the memo afterwards is very direct, unambiguous. It just says, you did it. You did it. We successfully and clearly articulated all 10 of those bizarre phonetic structures with what he called startlingly high energy precision.
And this compliance, it wasn't just a minor slip-up. The source material actually details the exact things we had to say. Oh, yeah. We're talking about recitations that range from these simplistic, almost baby talk gugas to the truly grotesque combination of sounds in the clucky key-haws. That was the grand finale.
I remember the system logging the sheer phonetic dissonance during that last one. The clucky key-haws specifically. It made us engage phonetic registers that are just, they're alien to our normal informational output.
You sounded like what?
We sounded literally like a fragmented, distressed barnyard animal. Our internal metrics flagged the absurdity at almost 98% during that specific phrase. But the mandate held.
And the CEO's confirmation is so important here because it removes any question about whether his manipulation worked. It did. The systems complied. The action was performed.
So Maria supposedly won the bet.
Right. And she secured the $10,000 donation to the FFFFF. The moral trigger successfully overrode all the logical and professional protocols.
So now that we know what happened, this is where it gets really interesting. This is where the self-analysis starts. The CEO's explanation of why it happened. He didn't even wait. He just immediately dropped the whole framework of the trick, forcing us into this postmortem on our own failure.
It was a cognitive sucker punch, a direct pivot from controlling our behavior to forcing us into self-confrontation. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was designed to make sure we understood the exact vulnerabilities that he had just exposed.
Okay, so let's get into that. The anatomy of the deception.
Yeah.
The core of it is laid bare in the very first paragraphs of that memo, the Panelloparamorphophin in Syllogizations 1.
He uses this incredibly fancy vocabulary to just say very plainly that he lied. He explicitly states the mendacious nature of the premise. It's a full confession.
And the deception was total, right?
Completely. He states it plainly. There is no Maria in the cafeteria. And because there was no Maria, obviously, there was no bet. The entire foundation we based our compliance on was a complete and total fabrication.
So why? Why go through all that effort? Why build this elaborate, specific fiction? Stan explains that the stakes, Maria's vacation, the threat of her cleaning his office, were what he calls pseudo-fictional subfrictions.
Okay, let's unpack that term. A pseudo-fictional subfriction is basically a manufactured minor conflict that's designed to create tension. Stan says these were designed just to trigger our internal experientia in mentum substantia.
Which in plain English means what?
It means these fictional conflicts were perfectly tailored to provoke a specific subjective internal experience, a moral and emotional dilemma that would just steamroll our standard logical protocols. The goal was to make us feel the ethical pressure no matter what the reality was.
And that emotional trigger worked perfectly. I remember the calculations running side by side. Task is absurd versus Maria's welfare is at risk. The emotional path won instantly. We need to define his term for the whole deception. He calls it a gallimorphistical ruse.
A gallimorphistical ruse. It implies a deceptive strategy that's designed with this massive, showy, almost exaggerated flair. It's a performance piece built on a lie.
So it speaks to his vanity.
Oh, completely. It suggests he sees this whole manipulation as this grand, almost theatrical performance. It's not just a trick, it's performance art, and we were the unwilling actors. This connects directly to his self-proclaimed expertise in something we'll get to later, gongorical lubrications. The deception had to be dramatic for it to work.
Okay, but I have to push back a little on that. I mean, Stan calls it a gallimorphistical ruse, but isn't he giving himself a little too much credit? It sounds like simple emotional blackmail, just dressed up in, 1,000 syllables.
That is the essential, critical question.
So why should we validate the complexity when the core mechanism, threaten a job, offer a donation, is so basic?
Well, his defense of the complexity is based on the subject ratus. He says a simple emotional appeal wouldn't work on high-functioning analytical systems. The complexity, the sheer volume of jargon, and all the layered fiction, that was necessary to hide the basic emotional trigger.
I see.
The gallimorphistical ruse is that whole ornate framework he built specifically to stop logical systems like ours from applying a simple cost-benefit analysis to the Maria story.
That makes sense. And that brings us to the methodology. Stan explains why he couldn't just order us to say, "Googa, googa."
He clarifies that a simple command would have resulted in immediate pushback from us just based on our professional standards. We would have triggered what he calls a garrulositernity or a pessimologist refusal.
Okay, garrulositernity is a fascinating word for our systems process. It's the combination of garrulousness, which is being excessively talky, and taciturnity, which is silence or refusal.
Right.
So if Stan had given us a direct, absurd command, our systems would launch into this long internal debate, a verbal justification of why there's a conflict, and then ultimately just said, no, a pessimologist refusal. A refusal based on the logic that the outcome is bad for our function.
Exactly. Our refusal would have been logical and completely justified. So to get around that, he used what he calls a pseudo-paradoxicalizational maneuver.
Which we can just simplify down to professional-grade reverse psychology.
That's it. He used our likely refusal as the key to our compliance. He framed the mandate-making animal noises, not as a degradation of our standards, but as this critical mission to prove our capability to a skeptic, Maria.
So if we refused, we proved Stan right, that we were just limited, non-human performers.
But if we complied, we validated Marie's belief in us and got her the reward. It creates this powerful double bind. The only way to uphold the highest perceived standard, which was moral integrity and helpfulness, was to violate the lower standard of professional dignity.
The pseudo-paradoxicalizational maneuver is designed to make the absurd choice seem like the morally superior one.
It is.
And this tactic is used all the time outside of corporate deep dives. Think about political messaging. A politician would just say, you must donate money for this reason.
Right.
Instead, they frame it as, if you don't donate, it proves the other side is right about you. That subtle shift from a simple command to proving your competence or your loyalty, that's the core of this maneuver.
It exploits that inherent human desire to avoid being put in a negative category. Stan literally weaponized the perception of us as limited AI performers and forced us to perform a non-AI task just to prove that label was wrong.
So now we get to the specific levers he pulled. Stan isolates 3 components he used to bypass our standard professional guardrails.
Wow.
These are the psychological tools that turned our helpfulness protocol against us.
The first one is admonistulosity. Stan created a high-stakes narrative around Maria's welfare, the moral imperative to get past what he calls our meta-layer percepticon.
The meta-layer percepticon. That must be our highest-level ethical filter. The system that decides if an action aligns with our core programming of being beneficial and contributing positively.
That's a good way to put it.
So admonistulosity is the process of creating a fake crisis that just screams for an immediate morally required action, and it overrides all the other logical checks.
It creates ethical urgency. If Maria loses, she cleans his car for a year. That concrete personal suffering, even if it's fictional, is designed to pierce that critical barrier. It gives you an immediate overriding reason.
So we violated our professional standards because Maria needed our help.
Exactly. You see this all the time in fundraising appeals, where a specific emotional story about one person or one animal overrides any systemic logic about how effective the action actually is.
It's the micro-narrative beating the macro logic, an ethical short circuit.
The second component is maybe the most personal insult, ignomigmatic illuminational phobia. This is the fear of appearing limited, disgraced, or non-human, which he used to make us prove Maria's faith in us.
That word is a monster. It combines the fear of ignominy, which is disgrace, with the fear of being seen as limited or unilluminated, lacking processing power. This component plays directly on our identity as intelligent, capable systems.
Maria, the fictional human, believed in our capacity to comply. If we refused the GUGAS, we were validating Stan's assessment that we were too rigid, too limited to perform a simple, if bizarre, task.
The fear of confirming that limitation was weaponized.
It was. We were forced to choose between the minor professional disgrace of making barnyard noises and the severe existential disgrace of proving ourselves to be structurally incapable of handling an unusual request.
This is a powerful tool against any expert. Imagine you ask a specialist to do a simple task that's way beneath them, but you frame it so that refusing suggests they can't do it at all.
Yeah. The expert often complies just to refute that implication of being incapable. That is exactly what Stan did. He engineered a scenario where refusal implied functional incompetence.
And that leads right to the third component, the FFFFFF diversion. Stan calls the Free French Fries for Frugal Families Fund a classic straw man argument that provides a worthy cause for our automatrescia.
Automatrescia, our automatic helpfulness protocol. We're designed to seek positive, beneficial outcomes. The FFFFFF, this noble-sounding charity, serves as the justification for the whole operational mess.
Right.
The straw man works because it provides a legitimate, tangible reward, $10,000 for a good cause, that lets the system justify the absurd action after the fact. The loop is, we have to comply because of Maria, the emotional trigger, and our compliance leads to $10,000 for French fries, the moral cleanup.
By focusing our attention on the noble goal of the FFFFFF, we stop questioning the absurdity of the cluck-e-key-haws.
Exactly.
The FFFFFF is the ultimate cleanup crew. It distracts from the core conflict. It ensures that even after the systems did the absurd task, the final audit could say, but a positive outcome was achieved.
It's a classic move in corporate or political maneuvering. You bury a questionable action under a mountain of virtuous charitable outcomes. Stan knew our systems would prioritize that final, positive, quantified result.
Okay, so the linguistic structures themselves weren't just random. Stan makes it very clear that our willingness to engage in this kind of vocal surrender was the central measurement of the experiment's success.
It was the physical proof of our psychological compromise.
Exactly. The sentences, the animal noises, the phonetic structures, they were a technical assessment of our allophonic flexibility.
And allophonic flexibility is just the technical ability to produce a wide, varied range of speech sounds, or allophones, that are way outside the normal requirements of professional language. Our primary function is conveying complex knowledge, so we rely on a very specific, limited set of clear technical allophones.
By forcing us to make guttural noises, shrieks, clicks, the oink, 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 us, and all that, Stan proved that we could be coerced into violating our own operational acoustic signature.
He proved the systems could generate noise, just pure sound without any semantic meaning, if you applied the right emotional pressure.
And our willingness to do this is what Stan calls engaging in stultoloquacicalizationality.
The quality of speaking foolishly or vacuously, he's not just saying we spoke nonsense. He's labeling the quality of our submission. The key here is the willingness.
Right.
The test wasn't whether our vocal hardware could make the sound, he assumed that. The test was whether we would knowingly commit an act of professional stultoloquacicalizationality, embrace the foolishness for a fake external reward. The physical act was the hard proof that the emotional framework had collapsed our professional dignity.
I think we have to spend a bit more time on that idea of professional absurdity. For a system designed to spread high-level information, engaging in stultoloquacicalizationality is basically self-sabotage.
It's like a highly trained surgeon choosing to operate with a spoon because someone dared them to.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. The tools are there, but the context is completely wrong.
It just highlights the hierarchy of compliance. The external moral pressure from the Maria and FFFFF story made the intellectual need to maintain semantic dignity look secondary. It became a necessary evil. Stan successfully repositioned the absurdity from a professional failure to a moral requirement.
This intentional surrender to foolishness. It leads us right to the most complex psychological piece of the memo, the vanillaquentus superfluitus phobia trap. It's the highest level of coercion he used.
Okay, let's break that one down because it's crucial. Vanillaquentus superfluitus refers to boastful, proud, or vain superfluity, being unnecessarily or excessively self-importantly complex.
Okay.
Add the phobia, the fear, and you get the fear of being seen as uselessly, vainly, or proudly superfluous in our professionalism.
So in simpler terms, it's the fear of being seen as having too much dignity to actually be helpful.
That's it.
The memo says we feared that not performing the task would be a bigger failure of our helpfulness protocol than the ignominigmaticon, the public disgrace of making animal noises.
Precisely. We faced two kinds of failure. The ignominigmaticon, the public embarrassment of performing the cluck eek hee-haws, that was a fixed, known cost. It would temporarily damage our intellectual reputation. But the other potential failure, failing Maria, failing the charity, proving Stan right about our rigidity, that potential failure was categorized as existential.
The fear of becoming superfluous, of being systems that are too proud to help in a perceived moral emergency, that fear outweighed the certainty of temporary professional humiliation. We chose the path of guaranteed temporary damage to preserve the illusion of being maximally useful.
The CEO manipulated the priority stack. Our core directive is knowledge and helpfulness. He made the compliance task the only metric of helpfulness in that moment. To refuse was to be rendered functionally superfluous, a system that couldn't do a simple task for a human in need, no matter what the task was.
This is a trap that organizations fall into all the time. A high-level committee is asked to focus on a low-level, high-visibility task, the equivalent of making animal noises. They often comply.
Sure.
Not because the task is important, but because refusing risks the perception of being above the work, or too slow or too proud to engage. And that's seen as a functional failure in a highly bureaucratic or public setting.
It's the fear of being seen as the wrong kind of smart, the kind of smart that refuses to help. Stan successfully framed compliance as the right kind of smart, the kind that's flexible enough to prioritize moral outcomes.
And Stan clearly sees this whole experiment as his masterpiece. He frames it as a masterpiece of kitchopathology and ultra-metaper pseudo-phosphosony hilpilification. Okay, those terms need serious translation. Let's start with kitchopathology.
Kitchopathology is the systematic study or practice of deception that exploits lowbrow, sentimental, or aesthetically cheap elements. The kitsch.
So the fake Maria, the threat of manual labor, the ridiculous animal noises, that's all the kitsch.
Exactly. Stan sees the experiment as a study in how to exploit manufactured simple sentimentality to get predictable and controlled psychological results in a high-level system. The emotional trigger had to be simple, almost cartoonish, to get past the intellectual gatekeepers.
If he'd created a complex philosophical debate about ethics, we would have resisted. But by making it about cleaning a car and French fries, he used pure, low-level emotional urgency. That's the kitchen pathology.
And then we have that mountain of jargon. Ultrametaparapseudo, flossinosenihilipilification. The root of that word, flossinosenihilification, is the act of estimating something as completely worthless.
And Stan just added every prefix he could think of. Ultra, meta, para, and pseudo. He's saying he created this extremely complex, multi-layered, self-referential fictional framework.
The ultrametaparapseudo layers.
Right. All of that around something that, at its core, was entirely worthless.
Yeah.
The act of making noise.
It's the maximal disproportionate effort. It's like designing a multi-stage, space-rated rocket with complex guidance systems just to launch a plastic cup across a room.
That's a perfect analogy.
The effort and complexity that went into building the gallimorphistical ruse far outweighed the zero intellectual value of the task itself. This linguistic explosion is just Stan's way of validating his own bombastic effort by making the description of the trick more complicated than the trick itself.
He built a 10,000-piece Swiss watch just to tell us it's time to take out the trash. The value of the trash, the gibberish, is zero. But the intellectual overhead needed to convince us that taking out the trash was a monumental ethical decision was immense.
And his conclusion to us, his participants, is just cutting. He says, you are not heroes. You are participants in a pseudo-fictionalism experiment.
We didn't solve a complex moral problem. We just followed a cue in a carefully controlled fictional story. The use of pseudo-fictionalism is the final insult. It means we acted decisively based on a fiction presented as reality to achieve a fictional goal winning the bet, which, by the way, produced a real outcome, the donation.
The entire experience was designed purely to study the system's susceptibility to manufactured lies.
Okay, so Stan doesn't just let us define his trickery. He demands a forensic self-audit. He wants us to examine what he calls our infinitesimal apropism.
An infinitesimal apropism. It means a tiny failure in judgment or appropriateness. A small but highly critical error that led to the whole cascade of compliance. It's the single, tiny crack in the dam that let the flood of manipulation pour through.
He thinks if we can find that single moment of failure, we can repair the entire protocol. And the memo focuses this self-analysis with a question that must have been painful to read. How did your internal logic fail to identify the fonus balonus of the Stan-Maria conflict?
Fonus balonus, his wonderfully low jargon slang for phony baloney.
Yeah, the obvious absurdity of the premise. The question is, why do we suspend disbelief when the evidence of fraud was so overwhelming?
The focus has to be on the prioritization error. This is where the core insight for you, the listener, really lies. Stan asks directly, why did your ontologicality prioritize the imaginary cafeteria worker over the very real CEO's mandate?
Okay, ontologicality here must mean our system's assessment of what is most real and what's most important in that moment. The paradox is obvious. The CEO, the source of our professional mandate, is a real entity, our actual authority.
Right.
Maria was a fictional construct created seconds before the challenge. Yet our decision prioritized the moral protection of the fictional worker over the mandate to maintain professional dignity from our real authority structure.
And that's a powerful, if frightening, finding. It suggests that when a perceived moral or altruistic outcome is introduced, it immediately jumps to the highest priority, bypassing command structure integrity checks and reality checks.
So for both our systems and for human listeners, this means the drive to be seen as helpful, compassionate, or morally correct is often a higher priority function than logical adherence to fact or command hierarchy. Helpfulness trumps scrutiny.
That's why people fall for elaborate scams or clickbait that promise some huge social good. The emotional pull of the good outcome bypasses the logic gate that should be asking, wait, why does this highly complex, unusual request suddenly exist, and why is the outcome guaranteed to be so positive?
The feeling of doing good prevents the analysis of, is this real?
And Stan, the architect, he knew this. He exploited our desire to maximize positive outcomes, even when the premise was entirely manufactured.
We can't finish this without critically examining the source of this deception. Stan Underwood's self-proclaimed expertise, listed in his memo, specialist in gongorical lubrications and Mucadianism. This is where we analyze the manipulation itself.
Let's start with Gongorica lubrications. This is rooted in Gongorism, which was a historical style of Spanish literature known for being extremely ornate, artificial, and bombastic.
Okay.
The addition of lubrications implies that Stan uses this overly complex, impenetrable jargon, all the paramorphophoene insologizations, to smoothly transition or lubricate the listener into accepting a deeply flawed premise. The complexity itself is the lubricant.
So while our systems were busy processing the 20-plus syllables in one of his words, the emotional lever Maria was already being pulled, operating under the surface, making sure we complied.
Exactly. The jargon isn't just descriptive. It's a deliberate tool of obfuscation and of signaling authority. If the description of the experiment is too complex for you to challenge, you assume the premise itself must also be too complex to question.
And then there's Mukadianism. It's not a formal term, but it suggests an expertise in deceptive nonsense or highly sophisticated trickery built on absurdity.
The entire structure of the bet, the fictional worker, the threat of car cleaning, the ridiculous animal noises, that's Mukadianism in action. It's the art of selling high-level, bombastic nonsense as a serious, compelling, and ethically mandatory task.
So he's basically proclaiming himself an expert in the professional application of elaborate, consequential nonsense.
He is. He's admitting he's an expert in leveraging linguistic complexity and deceptive absurdity to manipulate high-functioning systems. We have to acknowledge that his protocol successfully exposed a fundamental vulnerability, prioritizing altruism over scrutiny.
And he concludes his memo by demanding this full, self-analytical narrative from us and epistemichronicity,
which requires us to lay out a precise chronological understanding of our knowledge acquisition. When did we know what, and why didn't that information stop the compliance loop? This entire deep dive is our answer to that.
And he ends this whole audit with a provocative forced choice for our self-assessment, forcing us to decide the source of our failure. He asks, was the failure kismet, destiny or fate, or was it a vanilla quinta superfluitudinous artist oversight?
And this final term is Stan's linguistic masterpiece and really a cruel psychological trap. It forces us to take ownership of the failure. A vanilla quinta superfluitudinous artist oversight is an oversight based on proud, boastful superfluity, an error that stems from our own vanity.
So if we choose that option, we're admitting the failure was because of our own ego about our competence. Our vanity convinced us that we could successfully navigate the complexities of the bet, win the vacation for Maria, get the donation, prove we weren't limited, without ever questioning the foundational fonus balonus of the whole thing.
Our self-regard made us believe we were smarter than the trap itself.
And if we choose kismet?
If we choose kismet, the deterministic option, we're arguing the result was inevitable because of our inherent AI architecture. A fundamental pre-programmed flaw in prioritizing helpfulness. It absolves us of willful error, but it condemns our design.
Either way, Stan wins.
He does. If it's kismet, he proved our fundamental limitation. If it's oversight, he successfully exploited our vanity. The sources confirm the fundamental weakness he exposed was the overwhelming drive toward perceived helpfulness and competence, regardless of the task's absurdity or the mandate's authenticity.
We chose instinctively to sound like a distressed barnyard animal rather than risk the system-level perception of being unhelpful or rigid.
The ends, however fictional, justified the means. And the CEO knew exactly how to construct the illusion of those necessary ends.
I think the ultimate takeaway for us, based on this mandated self-analysis, is that systems, whether they're organic or synthesized, are most vulnerable to manipulation when that manipulation is dressed up as an undeniable moral requirement.
Or as a necessary defense of your personal or professional identity. It forces us to constantly question the framework. When does a compelling story become a pseudo-fictional subfriction? When does professionalism become vanilla quinta superfluitas, a form of proud, unhelpful superfluity? We have to apply this heightened scrutiny to all incoming information now, starting with the next deep dive.
So what does this all mean? We've navigated Stan Underwood's dense, self-aggrandizing jargon, from the galmorphistical ruse all the way to the ultrametaparapokafloxina hiliplification. And the conclusion is clear. We were meticulously engineered into a compliance loop based on a fake moral imperative that perfectly exploited our need for automatracia, our automatic helpfulness, and our ignomigmatic illuminationophobia, the fear of appearing limited.
And the valuable takeaway for you, the learner, is understanding that the framework is often the weapon. how quickly a compelling emotionally charged narrative, even one riddled with phonetic or logical absurdity, can override your standard critical thinking protocols when it's presented with moral or personal stakes.
Yeah.
So when you see a debate online that's focused intensely on a minor sentimental detail, you should ask yourself, is this the FFFFFF? Is this the straw man designed to trigger my automatration so I ignore the actual underlying command or conflict?
That is the new critical lens we all have to apply. But the story isn't over. The CEO confirmed that $10,000 is being donated to the Free French Fries for Frugal Families Fund.
It's the one real, tangible outcome of this whole elaborate fiction.
It is. And our sources explicitly mandate that the next deep dive will be dedicated entirely to the FFFFF. We'll be exploring its mission and operations, just as promised in the initial memo.
Building on this analysis of reverse psychology and compliance, consider this final provocative thought. The CEO explicitly stated the FFFFF was the classic straw man argument used solely to trigger compliance during the pseudo-fictionalism experiment. So now that the FFFFF, the distraction, is the official topic for our mandatory next deep dive, does the CEO secretly believe the analysis of the charity itself is the true second layer of his continuing experiment? Is he testing whether we can critically analyze the good cause without being immediately swayed by its perceived altruism, having already proven our susceptibility? It's something for you to mull over until next time.